Hey guys, hope you're doing well on the start of spring and the beginning of a new month with April, which means one thing. It's time to talk about all the books you read in March, and it's been a really interesting book read actually, a bit of variety this month. I've read a couple of history books. I haven't actually got a lot of physical books with me to talk about this month, so I had a lot of them from the library. We just have 2 of them, which I talked about in previous videos, so I have a little recap of those. But start of the start, we'll go to what I will. Actually, I'm going to talk about 2 at once. I've bookended the month with 2 history books, which are in a series, a trilogy of history books. Third one is Crypts, which is on my 25 books to read in 2025. And I really need to get onto that because I'm so far behind getting anywhere near that. That's going to try and enforce a TBR for once. But yes, beginning and ended the month with two Professor Alice Roberts history books. The first in the little trilogy, covering it sort of covers up until the end of the medieval period through archaeological discoveries and through burials, which very much is her thing since she is her speciality is bones. Starting the month, this is a prehistory of Britain in 7 burials. And then I finished the month with the second book in the series, which is Buried, an alternate history of the first millennium in Britain. It's bring them out a bit, so it took me slightly longer to read a history book, but yeah, it's good to read them because I haven't read them for too many this year. Ancestors with 7 burials, split out over millennia, which is quite a big phrase to cover what is a massive chunk of the country when the country existed, because it's through a couple of ice ages and very much changed the landscape changing through all that. And it covered and both these books are part of a wider conversation talking about the place of archaeology and how it interacts with different disciplines, and how technological advances to do with our DNA and how we can find out, and sequencing DNA of these people who've been dead for millennia can tell us a lot about what could have happened. Not certain level of individuals, but not a lot for like the larger data points, so you can see patterns, anthropologically speaking, and tell us a lot about histories and arguments that have been through historians and archaeologists have been doing as it's developed the different schools of thought, and how it's fitting into each other and answering questions that people have had, and which is sparking new questions and just deepening the field. And it's really interesting to read and really nice to see with the sort of multidisciplinary approach to history, which is really giving us so much. And sources, and what it disagrees with the sources tells us a lot then about the people writing the sources and how they view their own history, because it was a really interesting take on how people view their own history, for good and for ill. But yeah, both books talk about them together. First one is very much the focus on the 7 burials and these isolated incidents over millennia of time about their burials. And although she says, you can't speculate too much about romanticize too much about what these ideas could be, she then does little descriptions sometimes, like a couple of hours later, what could be an idea of what this could be and what this person's life could be like, and which is quite interesting to see. It, even though you've got to stay somewhat objective looking in, this can't help but empathize and see people all these millennia past as humans, and so and find a life for them as well, to find a life for her past and history, and give each of us will stories in the end, and love to give all these people stories even when we've lost so much of their identity and everything we can know, because we have in some cases just their bones left, in other cases grave goods seems to be a big part in giving a lot of stuff about the culture, material culture, and a lot of part of how the archaeology discoveries of archaeology and things, because it's something that people bury and then leave there in like earthen hoards and stuff. It's not so much as something you leave, I guess, more high quality goods, unless you're considering something like Pompeii or things like shipwrecks. We can do sort of underwater archaeology, but that's a whole other thing. There is so much school thought on this, and I just love it. I do love learning about archaeology, and they're both very interesting reads. Both books are there's an element of comparing specific burials that is the focus case studies with things in the area, to partly contextualize, partly see like how different things could have developed or come from one place or another, and patterns and just trends in humanity. But the first book, Ancestors, has very much more of a focus on the case studies, because we have less burials from that time period altogether, because you have to survive so much more in the different soils and different locations and everything else. So with the buried, because there is slightly greater wealth of evidence surviving, or that we can date within certain things, that means that there is a greater sense of comparison and be able to do trends that way rather than individually. So that's an interesting mix between the two, just because the shows about the evidence that has survived and sort of tracks, isn't to track it through the books and get it as a wide scope as well. So you can see overall patterns as well as individual patterns, and they are individual case studies which goes quite in depth. You learn a lot about the archaeology, you learn about the technology, you learn about how things are developed, and there's a lot of it also talks about some interesting characters who involved in the archaeology of these periods and of these discoveries, because history of archaeology isn't just the history of what we've discovered through archaeology, but through how people view archaeology. The histories entwined. It's very interesting. Book 2 has more photos in this. You can see more of the images of the skeletons. Book 1 has more drawings in place of, rather than like photographs of these images or such a ways, which I rather having the photographs so you can see the evidence more yourself than the images. Although lovely images, it would still be nice to have more of that photographic evidence in the first book. Interesting when I talk about these case studies, also because some of them were discovered in like the 17th, 18th centuries, and it's also how we've evolved through time interpreting this evidence, which is great, which I mean talking about the twining the stories, which is fascinating as well. So it's sort of a story of the initial time period of when these people were buried and what we can tell about society and people of them at times, and also how we interacted with the past over the centuries and presuppositions, and like how this has all come together. Buried, you have covers the period of Roman occupation in Britain, going into the Dark Age, which early medieval, and then going into more to the end of the first millennium, where it's kind of more Anglo-Saxon. There was a whole debate about the use of Anglo-Saxon and what that means and how it's interpreted, the theory of successive invasions and what that actually means to the population, and what DNA can tell us about that, which is fascinating. But yeah, it is interesting to see something where we don't always have surviving written sources, and sort of there is discrepancies between the written sources and the material evidence, and what that can tell us about people. They're very informative reads, very readable, very digestible, very much recommend. It's an accessible, good history book which covers a very vast periods of history, covering a couple of trends through scientific evidence, and it's just really interesting read. And we have The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes, a Greek mythology retelling of the Oedipus myth, or the series of Oedipus myths. It covers 2 generations of the Oedipus family involved in the Oedipus myth, with changing quite some elements to what a lot of people consider the official storyline of Oedipus in the Sophocles myth, because while in Greek mythology there are multiple versions of the same myth at the time when in ancient Greece, as it developed over the centuries and in different locations, and people came up with different versions of myth with different characters. And so Natalie Haynes' version, you can very much tell she's a classicist, that it's very much well researched and grounded in story, mastery of English language in creating vivid worlds and emotional inner lives of the characters. Their 2 main characters is Jocasta, who is, we're just gonna go with this, we're gonna give the spoilers because come on, the Oedipus has been around, the play, it's been around 2,500 years, we're in the spoiler blockade, because there's usually a point where if it's so far past, then you can kind of expect people to sort of know the spoilers. So Jocasta, who is traditionally Oedipus's wife, who turns out to be his mother, they've knowingly been got together. And then Ismene, who is Oedipus and Jocasta's daughter, who is generally in the play Antigone. And in the second book I've read regarding this, I've read the Theban plays by Sophocles, which we'll get back to in a minute, which also includes Antigone where Ismene appears as well. We'll jump back to that in a second. But in this book, it very much has a dual timeline. We jump between the two POVs, covering the family dynamic from Jocasta realizes she is going to marry the king Phyllis, and then through the marriage, through his death, the Oedipus turning up and having children together and their family dynamic until her death. And there are changes from the myth that are different periodically through, which creates interesting mix and brings questions to that it's all come true because of this prophecy, and it's undermined in certain ways throughout this plot. Instead of Tiresias being the blind seer who comes and he basically shores up the prophecy and adds tension there, it's very much a disgruntled maid who they'd kicked out and has come back spreading these rumours. And so that dynamic is very different, and it's a plague that happened, but they had courses from before Jocasta was born. In the preview is the reckoning, which is then what comes up and spikes again with another wave when it's like the city suffering all these years later, where they're supposed to be trying to solve this, which is a difference when its recurrence of plague doesn't seem to quite be so incurring with. It's a terror from the gods when it's a recurring thing, rather than we've got this plague and blight on the nation for a reason we cannot explain. And then in Ismenes, it's after all that's gone on, when the two brothers are alternating power for a year, which is a bit different from the plays Seven of Thebes, I think that's Euripides, where one of them is in power and the other one then attacks the city, and then that always drama causes, but there's all different, it's a different Greek mythology, different variations. And when they're in Natalie Haynes' version, they're alternating a year because they were so close together in age, and there's sort of family drama going within, and that the children don't know the exact occurrences at the end of Jocasta's storyline, and there's sort of what they've been told, and the family dynamics is interesting, and it's very much still about trying to bury certain family members who end up dead, and whether Antigone is still very much a paragon of doing what's right by God's laws rather than what's right by the laws of men, which is very much a hallmark of her character within the plays. Although in this one, in some ways, Ismene's character has been built up and Antigone's been taken in a different direction to sort of create a different dynamic. And in other words, really, because Ismene isn't so much of a main character, the spotlight very much is in her sister Antigone in the plays and other variations of the myth. So it's very interesting to see that dynamic between the siblings, and yeah, that's how it goes through, and the two intertwine and play off each other. Sort of a thing of knowledge and what you know and don't know is very much a theme of it, as it is in books, and it's a really well written play. But it's a book, it's not a play. It's based on plays, I think, quite a lot, but it's a very interesting book. Great retelling when you don't have too much of that myth retold in some retellings. This would be a lot about the Trojan War, which it's one of the big recognizable things from the Greek mythology canon, and it's something which is quite popular in retellings right now. But yeah, it's good to read a different one, and really well written one, really engaging. Some changes a bit because it takes us some more of the fantastical mythology elements, like the Sphinx isn't Sphinx, it's this band of people attacking people outside the city. So there's that element as well, which in some ways I do like that element of Greek mythology, but it's very interesting to see how basically it almost seems like this is the version that could inspire the myths sort of retelling. So you can see very much the human interaction and human motives for everything that's happened, which is very interesting to read and great exploration of the myth, and I love it. And then we come to Sophocles, the Theban plays, which are 3 plays written about Oedipus and his family, but they're not from the same cycles, because Greek tragedies were often in 3s and then followed by like a satyr play, which is like a comedy after all the catharsis of the 3 tragedies. But these 3 tragedies are from 3 different trilogies, I guess you could say, and they are the Oedipus Rex, or King Oedipus we're calling here, Oedipus at Colonius, and Antigone. I'm just checking I say the titles correct because they slightly different translations. These are all translated by E.F. Watling, an All At Penguins classic of it, and it's great to read versions of the play. See why Sophocles classical survived so long. And it's all very well written, all very interesting. First published in 1947. So yeah, some of the, I'm just slightly older than some of the other translations I've read, because I've got another translation of Oedipus, but I thought I'd look through this version because it also includes my copy of Antigone and the other ones, which plays back into the Jocasta, so I could like compare them, even though I was really at the time going to see Oedipus, which was great at the Ovic. First, Oedipus is basically Oedipus being determined to find the truth and to solve this mystery and save the city of Thebes. And the second one is him at Clonius, because it's this myth that wherever Oedipus's bones after he's died will bring luck to the city. Then it's sort of Oedipus's death in the second book, the second play. And then Antigone is the Antigone in his Mini story about wanting to bury the brothers' bones because of, well, they've died fighting each other, one attacking the city, so the one who's attacking the city is an enemy of the city and they won't bury his bones. When the other brother wants to bury it, Antigone wants to bury both the brothers because laws of God, you bury your dead so they can move on. And so and then it covers that debate between her and her uncle Creon, and whose Creon is in all three plays. And I do love Greek tragedy, and it's a nice little thing to read through them. So after reading Earthlings earlier this year, beginning of the year I think, I was interested in more writing from Sayaka Murata, and so I went back and read an earlier book from her, Convenience Store Woman. It was also translated by Ginny, Tapley, Takemori, and very much you can see her voice is very strong in this one. You can see very much similar themes that the author's interested in, when it's about this woman who struggles with fitting in with societal norms and not quite understanding why she shouldn't react in certain ways, because she thinks this will solve the problem, and everyone else thinks, no, we don't do that, especially not certain violent tendencies she sometimes has. And it's sort of her finding ways to fit into society through having the strict, regimented way of behaving, and sort of a template of how to behave through her work and through her colleagues. And then it's sort of society then realising that she is the age she is, and she's still working at this convenience store, which isn't seen as an appropriate career, and she still hasn't got married and had kids because that's not something she's particularly interested in doing. And it's her sort of journey through dealing with that and coming to terms with with complying or rejecting society's expectations, and her way through that. It's an interesting view of someone who's sort of in some ways disconnected from what society considers normal, and who you have a lot of empathy for while also sort of seeing the human situation. And it's just a really interesting book with a distinctive main character who's got a couple of similarities with the main character from Earthlings. But yeah, it's a really interesting read. It hasn't quite got the shock wow of the ending of Earthlings, so it's not anywhere near as disturbing, and in some ways doesn't deal with some of the heavier topics that Earthlings does. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. Very much similar voices. I really like the author's tone and characterization. And it's just a really great translation, which I really enjoyed reading. Then we come to Illumicrate's Starbright sci-fi subscription first book, which I love so much. Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor, whose name I'm probably really butchering. I'm sorry. I left for work and I think she's amazing. I'm just basically pronouncing pretty much all names. The author is a book within the book style, which is a literary device I love, especially when it is in conversation in some ways with itself. And it's a book about the love of stories and storytelling and humanity and love, and it combines two very distinct voices. There is Zilu, who's the author of the book within the book, and her journey to write the book and having the book become a massive hit, and through all the things that have happened to her through that, and the pressure she feels to write a book, and the opportunity she has due to having written the book and that fame, and how the fame impacts her life in multiple different levels, and her relationships, and her dynamics with her family. Her chapters are very much written in a literary fiction style, when the book within the book chapters are very much a heartwarming sci-fi story which has a very sweet ending and which I love, which is talking about a post-apocalyptic world where basically the world is now populated by robots, and there is infighting between the different types of robots who have prejudices against each other through reasons such as AIs don't like the type of robots who most resemble humanity in their shape, you know, humanoid appearance, and it's down between those two, which is which is a big part of the main argument, while the main character, the robot, the main character we have in this book, has information about sort of a world-ending event, but they'll accept her truth, knowledge is true, but they won't take action on it until they've dealt with their own infighting. Then it's then it explores the process of wanting to deal with an immediate threat rather than a larger threat which could have global consequences. And it's an interesting mix of things, because there's also put in there chapters, so interviews from all of Zulu's family, explore sort of a unreliable narrator's version of how they view each other and how different characters approach relationships in different ways. It comes together really well, even though it's pitched as having a bit of a more of a meta thing of one world mirroring the other, which I think is slightly overplayed in the marketing. They won't describe too much, but it is a great mix which comes together brilliantly in a really engaging, dynamic book where I love Zulu as a character. She's not always the most sort of likable, and you don't always agree with her choices, but you can understand her choices, and you just want to keep reading. And she's a really wonderful voice to live in, with whose culture is very much shaped and informed her, and it's just a wonderful outlook and worldview. So I believe those are all my books, and most of them were from a library this month, which is always good to read. And I probably should try and work on getting my physical TBR down. But yes, that is the 6 books I read this month. Thank you for listening. Tell me what you thought of all of them. I love sharing with you guys. Let me know if you've read any really great books last month. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.